Hi friends, there's something deeply compelling about a man who intuitively anticipates a woman's needs, who listens carefully, who offers without being asked. He seems attuned, emotionally intelligent, often praised for being a real man, in an age where empathy is rare. And yet, behind the curtain of this emotional generosity lies a complicated psychology, one that is not always about the woman, but about the man's internal landscape, his wounds, his longing for identity. Men who please women first often grow up in environments where their emotional expression was not just allowed but required for survival. These are not necessarily abusive homes, but they are homes where the boy learns that being attuned to others, especially women, is the safest road to emotional connection. Perhaps his mother was overburdened, emotionally unstable, or chronically dissatisfied, and the boy, in his tender and loyal heart, took on the role of the soother. He learned to read moods the way others read books. He became fluent in emotional nuance. He figured out that his value wasn't in being himself, but in being what someone else needed. Creates a man who finds comfort in being wanted but is unsure about being needed for who he actually is. He becomes the emotional caretaker, the one who checks in, who fixes things, puts her pleasure above his own, not always because of altruism, but because it confirms his place in the relationship. Satisfaction becomes the mirror in which he sees his reflection. If she is happy, then he is enough. But there's a cost to living like this. When a man chronically prioritizes a woman's needs, desires, and boundaries before his own, he starts to disappear. The very act of pleasing, when done compulsively, a form of self-erasure. He stops asking himself, "What do I want?" He becomes so preoccupied with being desirable, agreeable, generous, he disconnects from his authentic desire. Over time, he may find himself feeling resentful, drained, unappreciated, but unable to explain why. He may not even realize he's angry, because pleasing has become his default mode of connection. He doesn't yet see that his kindness is also a strategy, not just a virtue. There is a particular kind of power in pleasing. Passive, but it's quietly controlling. Because when you are always the giver, you are the one shaping the emotional tone. You position yourself as indispensable. You make yourself so essential to her emotional ecosystem that your absence would be felt like an earthquake. And this gives you a subtle authority, one that can mask a deep fear of being abandoned. Some men please because they do not know any other way to be loved. Love not as a state of being, but as a task to be earned, a service to be rendered. Their self-worth is not internal. It fluctuates based on how others respond to them. This can make them attentive lovers, emotionally rich partners, but it also makes them fragile. If she withdraws, criticizes, or doesn't reciprocate with equal intensity, feels like a threat to their entire identity. They may become anxious, overcorrect, try harder, because the loss of her pleasure feels like a loss of themselves. It's emotional. It shows up physically, intimately. In bed, these men focus obsessively on her pleasure. They delay their own gratification, sometimes indefinitely. They are praised for being generous lovers, but what's happening underneath is that her pleasure becomes a scoreboard for their value. If she climaxes, he has succeeded. He's failed. Sex becomes performance. Intimacy becomes proof. Connection becomes currency. But what happens when a man like this meets a woman who actually wants reciprocity, who doesn't want to be put on a pedestal, who wants to feel the man's rawness, his edges, his truth? That's when things begin to unravel. She might say, "Tell me what you want," and he'll struggle to answer. She might notice his inability to receive, discomfort with being vulnerable without being useful. She may grow frustrated with his lack of initiative, his passivity. What she once found endearing, the attentiveness, starts to feel like a wall between them. It becomes clear he's not doing it for her, doing it for what it gives him. A sense of control, a sense of being needed, a place in her world. There's another layer. Pleasing is often a survival mechanism born out of shame. These men carry the quiet belief that their authentic self is not enough, so they become who they think a woman wants. It's not manipulation, it's adaptation. They are emotionally shape-shifting to gain approval. And this works for a while, until it doesn't, until she sees through it, until he realizes that despite all his efforts, she still leaves, or she stays but doesn't respect him, or worse, she loves him but doesn't truly see him. Intimacy requires authenticity. It requires a man to be in contact with his own needs, even when they conflict with hers. It means being able to say no, to take space, to let her be disappointed. These are difficult acts for the man who's built his identity on being liked. But they are necessary acts for the man who wants to be loved. Doesn't mean that pleasing is wrong. On the contrary, the capacity to tune in, to care, to prioritize someone else's experience. These are beautiful traits. But they must be rooted in wholeness, not in lack. Otherwise, they are not acts of love, they are bids for validation. When a man learns to please from a place of abundance, rather than scarcity, everything changes. He can give without resentment. He can receive without guilt. He can say, I want this, and know that it doesn't make him selfish. It makes him human. The irony is that the very men who are terrified of being perceived as selfish often end up losing themselves entirely. They become so focused on proving their goodness that they never give themselves permission to be complex, contradictory, flawed. And relationships need all of that. Women don't want perfect men, they want real men. Men who can hold them but also challenge them. Men who can yield but also lead. Men who can say yes but also no. When a man prioritizes a woman's pleasure emotionally or physically, he must ask himself why. Is it because he wants her to feel cherished? Because as he fears what will happen if he doesn't? Is he connected to her? Or is he trying to manage her perception of him? These questions matter. They point to the difference between pleasing and connecting. To reclaim this balance, a man must confront the internal split between who he is and who he thinks he must be. Sit with the discomfort of not being liked all the time. He must risk her anger, her disappointment, even her silence. And in doing so, reclaim something sacred, his inner authority. He no longer needs to chase harmony at the cost of his truth. He learns to love without losing himself. There's profound courage in this transformation. It is not easy to break the pattern of pleasing. It requires a deep reckoning with childhood wounds, with the roles one played in the family, with the ways one learned to survive love. But on the other side of this reckoning is freedom. A man who no longer pleases compulsively is a man who can choose consciously. He doesn't love because he needs to be loved, loves because he is loved. And the women who meet these men, they feel the difference. They are not flattered, they are moved. Because when a man brings his full self into a relationship, his joy, his anger, desire, his boundaries, he becomes trustworthy. Not because he's always agreeable, but because he's real, he's solid, he's whole. This is the psychology behind the man who pleases women first, a mixture of beauty and pain, strength and fear, love and performance. To understand him is to understand the human condition itself, a longing to be seen, to be valued, to belong. But the ultimate journey for this man is not to abandon his tenderness, anchor it in truth. To offer, not from emptiness, but from overflow. To care, not because he's afraid, but because he is free. Some men grow into their adult relationships, carrying an emotional blueprint that was shaped long before they ever fell in love. The kind of man who puts a woman's needs before his own, who seems to always know what to say, who softens his voice when she's tense, who sacrifices his own comfort to make sure she feels safe and desired. This man did not just wake up one day and decide to be this way. His pleasing nature has roots, and those roots often stretch back to childhood experiences that taught him emotional caretaking as a form of identity. He learned not only how to read emotions, but how to manage them. And it began when he was still a boy. In many cases, this begins in homes where emotional boundaries are blurred or reversed. A boy might be raised by a parent, often a mother, who, due to her own emotional wounds or unmet needs, leans on the child for support that should come from another adult. He may not be physically abused or neglected in any dramatic sense, but he begins to absorb subtle cues. When I am good, she calms down. When I listen to her, she smiles. When I stay quiet, the room stays peaceful. These patterns are powerful and deeply formative. Instead of the boy being cared for, he becomes the one doing the caretaking, and this is how he first learns to belong. Not through his needs, but through his ability to meet the needs of others. This emotional reversal becomes a silent contract. The boy starts to feel responsible for other people's happiness. If his parent is sad or angry, he believes it's up to him to fix it. If someone is distant, he reaches for them. Conflict arises, he tries to mediate, becomes emotionally intelligent far beyond his years. But it comes at a price. That price is the loss of his own authentic inner voice. Over time, he may forget how to name what he wants, he feels what he needs. Because those things were never safe to prioritize. In fact, they may have even been punished or ignored. This child grows into a man who feels most at home in relationships where he is needed. Not merely loved, but needed. Because if he is not indispensable, then he doesn't know who he is. He gravitates toward women who seem intense, expressive, even chaotic. Part of him longs for that familiar terrain. And without realizing it, he places himself in a position of being the emotional anchor, the one who listens, the one who gives more, the one who adjusts, accommodates, and solves. At first, this feels like love. It feels like connection. But it's actually a pattern, one that was wired into his nervous system long ago. Even as an adult, this man's nervous system is scanning for cues. Is she happy? Is she upset? What did her silence mean? How can I fix this before it becomes a problem? He becomes hypervigilant, not out of fear of physical harm, but fear of emotional rupture. Because if she withdraws, criticizes, or stops affirming him, the little boy inside him feels like he's disappearing. Approval becomes unbearable. Not because he can't tolerate disagreement, but because her displeasure activates his core fear that love is conditional and it can be revoked at any moment. This is the hidden origin story of the man who pleases women first. It's not just a personality trait, it's a survival strategy forged in the emotional atmosphere of his early life. He learned to be useful before he learned to be known, to manage other people's feelings before he ever felt safe expressing his own. And so, even when he appears calm, generous, easygoing, underneath, often a current of anxiety. He fears that if he stops giving, if he stops pleasing, the love will stop too. And in this fear, we see the cost come indispensable, but not truly seen. There is a particular kind of man who is celebrated for being thoughtful, for prioritizing a woman's needs, for anticipating her desires before she even speaks them. He is often praised as the ideal partner, sensitive, caring, responsive, but underneath this devotion, quiet a truth that is rarely spoken. His instinct to please is not just about her happiness. It is about his worth. Deep down, pleasing becomes the way he proves that he deserves love. It becomes the currency of his self-esteem. From an early age, received the message, explicitly or implicitly, that love must be earned, that to be lovable, he must be agreeable, that to be wanted, he must be useful. These beliefs take root slowly over time. They are not shooted but whispered through moments. A caregiver who only smiles when he's quiet, who withholds affection when he expresses anger, who rewards compliance but punishes independence. He learns that his needs are secondary, maybe even inconvenient. And so, he becomes adaptable. He becomes attuned. He becomes skilled at reading the room and adjusting himself to fit. This self-adjustment is often misread as emotional maturity, but in reality it can be a form of survival. Because when a boy internalizes the idea that he must perform to be accepted, he will grow into a man who continues to perform even in love. Especially in love, relationships become stages on which he seeks approval, applause, reassurance. The more he gives, the more he hopes to be validated. Not for who he is, but for how well he can meet someone else's needs. The paradox here is painful. The very thing that makes him feel worthy, pleasing, is also the thing that can slowly strip him of his authenticity. He becomes so focused on her experience that he loses connection to his own. He knows how to ask, "Are you okay?" but not, "Am I okay?" He can say, "What do you want tonight?" but he hesitates to say, "Here's what I'd love." It's not just that he forgets his own desires. It's that he doesn't believe they matter unless they benefit someone else. His pleasure is tethered to her approval. This dynamic plays out in all corners of the relationship. Emotionally, he avoids conflict because he equates disagreement with rejection. He over-apologizes even when he hasn't done anything wrong. He is quick to smooth things over, to reassure, to repair, even at the expense of his own truth. Physically, he may become the kind of lover who is obsessed with her satisfaction, not because he is selfishly invested in her pleasure, but because he fears what it might mean if she is not fully pleased. Her pleasure becomes his performance review. And if she doesn't respond the way he hopes, disappointing, it's devastating. It confirms his secret fear that he is not enough. This kind of pleasing is not generosity. It's compensation, effort to make up for a perceived deficiency. And the more he gives, the more he hopes he will finally feel secure. But the security never fully arrives. No amount of external validation can fix an internal wound. She may love him. She may praise him. She may even adore how much he cares. If he doesn't feel inherently worthy, her love will never be enough. He will always crave more reassurance, more confirmation, more signs that he matters. And ironically, this constant pursuit of validation can lead to burnout, disconnection, even resentment. Because while he appears selfless, he is actually engaging in a subtle transaction. If I give enough, you'll never leave me. If I do everything right, you'll never reject me. But love doesn't work that way. And eventually, does not get the response he hopes for. He may feel confused, hurt, even angry. He may not say it out loud, but the feeling grows inside him. After everything I've done, not see me? This is the quiet exhaustion of the man who lives to please. His worth is always on trial. His value is always being measured. And the one doing the measuring is not just her, it's him. When a man lives to please, it often appears gentle, harmless, even virtuous. The one who says yes when others hesitate, who anticipates needs, who prioritizes harmony. He offers himself in quiet ways, through emotional labor, acts of service, all seemingly rooted in kindness. But kindness, when habitual and unquestioned, can sometimes become something else entirely: control. Not the overt, dominant kind, but the subtle kind that lives underneath the surface. Control dressed in generosity. Power disguised as selflessness. This man has learned to shape emotional experiences not by force, but by constant giving. He becomes the calm in the storm, the one who regulates the emotional temperature of the relationship. But his caretaking is not always about the other person's needs. It's about creating predictability. By being the one who keeps things smooth, fixes problems before they escalate, he shields himself from emotional chaos. He creates a sense of control not through domination, but through emotional management. Form of control is harder to name because it masquerades as goodness. He's rarely seen as manipulative. On the contrary, people might praise him for being easygoing, dependable, a good man. But if you look closely, you'll find that his ability to please is not just about generosity. It's about shaping the emotional field so that he doesn't have to deal with uncertainty, rejection, or vulnerability. If everyone is happy, then no one will leave. If he is always needed, then he can't be abandoned. This fear of disconnection drives much of his behavior. How to prevent emotional rupture? By becoming essential. He positions himself as irreplaceable, not in a boastful way, but by making himself so involved in her well-being that his absence would feel like imbalance. He does not demand love. He earns it quietly through consistent acts of emotional usefulness. But there's a cost: the relationship becomes tilted. He is always giving, always adjusting, always fixing. And because he rarely expresses his own needs, he silently expects her to notice, to reciprocate, to understand what he doesn't say. Spoken expectation becomes a hidden contract. He gives without asking, but deep down he hopes, maybe even believes, that his giving will be returned in kind. Not always directly, but through loyalty, admiration, love. When that doesn't happen, when she pulls back, sets a boundary, or expresses dissatisfaction, it destabilizes him. Doesn't know how to respond because his sense of value was never based on mutual exchange. It was based on emotional performance. He feels betrayed, not by her actions, but by the fact that his quiet contract has been broken. Power isn't always loud. It can be soft, persuasive, comforting. This man's pleasing nature becomes a way to subtly orchestrate emotional outcomes. He learns that when he gives more, people depend on him. When people depend on him, less likely to be left. This dependency becomes his safety net. It keeps him close to others, but also keeps him hidden from himself. Because as long as he is focused on managing other people's emotions, he doesn't have to confront his own. He doesn't have to name his fears, or his rage, or his longing. Stay busy being needed. But this emotional choreography has consequences. Over time, the woman in the relationship may start to feel something is missing. Not because he is neglectful, but because he is too agreeable, too passive, too absent from his own desire. Pleasing can feel like avoidance. He is always there, but rarely fully present. Struggle to connect with his authenticity because his identity is so tied up in being the good partner, the safe choice. And intimacy requires more than safety. It requires depth, honesty. This man's relationship to control is not malicious. It is unconscious. He doesn't see that his constant giving is a way to manage risk. Doesn't realize that his kindness is often a strategy. He doesn't know that behind his smile is a deep need to never feel powerless again. There is a quiet tension that lives inside the man who always puts others first, especially when that pattern becomes a default in romantic relationships. On the surface, easygoing, caring, tuned in. He always seems to know the right thing to do, the right moment to speak, the gesture that will land well. But beneath this calm exterior is often an internal war between what he truly desires and what he believes he must do in order to be loved. Caught between authenticity and approval, between instinct and expectation. He longs to express what's real for him, but he fears that doing so might make him unlovable. Over time, this man learns to censor parts of himself. His needs are filtered, his thoughts are measured, and his emotions are calibrated to maintain harmony. He avoids bringing up conflict because he doesn't want to be a burden. He withholds opinions because he doesn't want to be too much. He adapts constantly, all while quietly asking himself, if I show who I really am, will she stay? That question haunts his choices even when he's not aware of it. That he doesn't have desires. It's that they have been buried under layers of compliance and caretaking, shaped by a fear that if he takes up too much space, there won't be room left for love. This fear isn't baseless. For many men who adopt the role of pleaser, there is a deep history of emotional rejection. Somewhere along the way, learned that expressing his truth could lead to disconnection. Maybe he was punished for anger. Maybe he was mocked for vulnerability. Maybe he was simply ignored. The message was clear: your needs are dangerous. Your desires are excessive. Your voice will push people away. And so he learned to mute himself, not to lie, but to shrink. He became someone who feels safe only when he is silent about his own longing. But desire, even when hidden, doesn't disappear. It lingers beneath the surface, building pressure. It shows up in indirect ways, through passive resentment, emotional fatigue, or a quiet sense of emptiness. He may say everything is fine, but inside he feels starved for something real, not just for affection, but for recognition. To be seen not as the man who always gets it right, but as the man who also struggles, who also aches, who also wants. The man who says, "This is what I need," and doesn't fear the fallout. And yet to voice that truth feels threatening. Because if he starts living from a place of authentic desire, he risks disruption. He might face rejection. He might disappoint her. He might no longer be the ideal partner she fell in love with. And that is terrifying, because he has built his identity around being the safe harbor, the stable one, the man who doesn't ask for much. If he changes that script, what will happen to the relationship? Will she still love him if he stops pleasing and starts choosing? This is where the psychological split becomes painful. On one side is the part of him that wants to please, to maintain peace, to be loved. On the other is the part that wants to be real, to stop performing, to risk being misunderstood. He vacillates between these two selves, often without realizing it. He may even start to feel like he's losing himself. Not because he's being manipulated, but because he has never truly been allowed to belong without sacrificing pieces of himself. He starts to wonder if love and selfhood can coexist. To reclaim his desire, this man must confront the belief that his needs are dangerous. He has to recognize that being loved shouldn't require self-abandonment. He has to test what happened. He speaks from a place of truth, not performance. And he must learn that being loved for who he is, even when that self is inconvenient, is the only kind of love that truly nourishes. Until then, he will continue to live in that internal split, pleasing on the outside while etching on the inside. At some point, the man who has spent most of his emotional life pleasing others begins to feel the fracture inside himself. He starts to sense that something is missing, not from his relationships, but from within. He has mastered the art of being agreeable, of soothing tension, of making others feel safe and valued. But in doing so, he has slowly abandoned pieces of his own identity. His boundaries are blurred. His voice is quiet. His desires are foreign even to him. And yet he continues the performance because he fears that withdrawing his care, even momentarily, will cost him connection. He fears that love is conditional, always dependent on what he can offer and how well he can perform. The path toward healing this fracture is not about swinging in the opposite direction. It's not about becoming hardened or emotionally distant. It's not about rejecting the impulse to give care or support. Those qualities are deeply human and incredibly powerful. But they must come from a place of fullness, not a place of need. They must be rooted in self-awareness rather than unconscious strategy. The man who wants to stop living in that invisible contract, "If I please you, you'll love me," must begin by recognizing where he ends and the other person begins. He has to confront the fear that setting a boundary means being selfish. For so long he equated selflessness with love. But selflessness taken to the extreme becomes self-erasure. It becomes a denial of individuality in the name of harmony. He may have learned early on that asserting his needs caused conflict, that being bold in his desires resulted in withdrawal or punishment. And so, as a form of protection, he learned to minimize himself. He learned that it felt safer to be what others wanted than to risk being who he really was. But as a grown man, he begins to see how that adaptation, while once necessary, no longer serves him. It keeps him small, it keeps him silent, it keeps him dependent on the reactions of others for his own emotional equilibrium. The work is slow and it is subtle. It begins with moments, choosing to say no even when it would be easier to say yes, choosing to express frustration without wrapping it in apology, choosing to ask for something without fearing rejection. These are acts of reclamation. They are not aggressive, they are not about domination. They are about coming home to the self that was hidden under layers of performance. Each time he chooses to honor his inner world over the perceived safety of approval, he strengthens a muscle that has long been neglected. What begins to emerge is a new kind of masculinity, one that is not defined by how much he gives, but by how deeply he knows himself. He no longer needs to please in order to earn love. He no longer relies on her happiness as the metric of his worth. He starts to feel solid. Not because he controls the emotional atmosphere, but because he is anchored in his own truth. And in that anchoring, paradoxically, he becomes more capable of connection. Not a connection rooted in obligation, but in choice. He gives because he wants to, not because he's afraid not to. This shift transforms not only his inner world, but also his relationships. Partners begin to notice the difference. He becomes more present, more honest, more alive. He's no longer trying to manage their emotions. He's meeting them with his own. And when conflict arises, as it inevitably will, he doesn't retreat or over-accommodate. He stays. He listens. He speaks from the center of himself, not from the shell of who he thinks he should be. In this way, he begins to live without the constant need for affirmation. He learns that he can be loved and disagreed with at the same time. He learns that he can be flawed and still worthy. And most of all, he learns that being loved for his truth is far more satisfying than being admired for his performance. This is how he heals the inner split. By stepping into the fullness of who he is, unapologetically and without disguise, the man who lives to please must eventually ask himself a deeper question: what would love feel like if I no longer had to earn it? Because true connection is not built on performance. It is built on presence. It is not sustained by how much you give, but by how honest you are while giving. When a man reclaims his voice, his needs, desires, not at the expense of others, but in harmony with himself, he becomes unshakable. Not because he controls love, but because he no longer fears losing it. And in that space, he is finally free. Free to love without conditions. Free to be seen without the mask. And most of all, free to be chosen not for what he gives, but for who he truly is.